So I'm just briefly going to introduce Burma, which is the center that's hosting us, and then we'll get on to the real stuff. So Burma is a center for interdisciplinary research in media and culture at Birkbeck College, University of London. It's located within the School of Arts, and which is physically based at 43 Gordon Square, but for obvious reasons, we've been doing quite a lot of stuff online now, for a while now. And it's co-directed by my colleague Rebecca Cupid and myself, and both of us are lecturers at the Department of Film, Media and Cultural Studies. And BERMAC, as the name says, is an interdisciplinary center, and it focuses on it's the home of research, various strands of research in the Department for Film, Media and Cultural Studies, which includes art policy and management, journalism, film, television, and digital culture. So as you can see, we're very interdisciplinary, and so it's our home research center, but we also collaborate a lot, such as this evening. And before I start talking about the project itself, I just wanted to say thanks to our partners. So Art Monthly has been a great partner on this project. And we have also Chris McCormack from Art Monthly, who is also actually one of the participants in the project. Also Electra, who have supported us in various ways, mostly to do with marketing. And also the Center for Arts and Human Rights at Bard College, which is enabling these discussions through a fellowship that I obtained through a faculty fellowship. And I just want to thank Kat Black, who is the research assistant on this project and who has been guiding us through this process seamlessly for quite a few months now. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project itself before I introduce the speakers. So this panel is the first panel within a project called And Others, the Gendered Politics and Practices of Art Collectives. And it's a research project in many phases, and I still don't know how it's where it's going, in a sense that it will probably take a few more years before it somehow maybe feels completed or kind of is coming to some kind of a conclusion. And it started in 2019 formally, but the sort of seeds of it started before that through my PhD research, mostly focusing on the former Yugoslavia and encountering a lot of artist collectives, mostly in the period of the 60s to the 80s. And one thing that became very obvious very quickly, and I think is also something that comes out of my lived experience, but also many of us here, is that collectivity, as much as it is based a lot of the time on promises of emancipation, promises of doing things otherwise, promises of kind of some form of a corrective of kind of social conditions that we are working and living in. For me, a question very quickly became, how can collectivity be in any way radical or emancipatory, or offer an alternative if it reproduces structural inequalities of society and of social structures that these collectives are being formed in. In other words, I was coming across a lot of collectives in the former Yugoslavia, but also much broader as well since then, that were either entirely collectives of male artists and cultural workers, or they had this dual form of expressing themselves, where the names of collectives the artists involved in collectives would be always formally listed, and it would be names of male artists. But when you look at the work, when you look at the actual engagement with the work, you see a lot of women as well involved. So I started to ask questions around this, in particular in relation to some performance works and also some moving image work. So it was literally as simple as kind of analyzing the works, writing about them, and asking the question, well, who are the women who are here, and what are their roles, and where are their names, and how have these collectives been historicized? So this then led me to think about questions of labor, questions of social reproduction, questions of affective labor, and to begin to ask myself, how can we think of collectivity in a different way in relation to how we value labor within collective practice. And I was at the same time reading a lot about collectives and collectivity, and basically came to the conclusion that in most writing, that kind of, you could say the canon of kind of writing about collectivity, there's often this kind of paragraph that points to inequality or points to forms of support, points to support structures around collectives, but kind of puts it aside as beyond the scope of that text. And I kind of came across this over and over again in many books. On the other hand, I was reading a lot about social reproduction and feminist revisiting of artistic practices, and where this kind of work is being done, but when it comes to collectives, perhaps that's not a focus. So I really wanted to try to connect these studies of collectivity, feminist revisiting of art histories, writing on social reproduction, and kind of try and put all this together and think how we could work through this. So the project kind of has been developing in stages. I've been conducting some interviews with cultural workers, and I am continuing to do so. But at a certain point, I started to ask questions about methods. And also, I'm not only interested in studying collectivity, but also practicing collectivity in some way. So somehow I wanted to engage with the work, with the people that I was reading. So I was interested in this kind of, not just the kind of this passive way of responding to what I was reading, but actually generating a discussion that was bringing all of these things together. So I then thought about bringing together people to kind of ask these questions together and questioning how can we think about collectivity collectively. So the method became this process that I thought would culminate perhaps in these panel discussions, but I always found that panel discussions can often lead us or leave us kind of wanting more of a discussion. So I decided to structure it in this kind of way of staging flipped panel discussions, whereby the conversation and the engagement with each other's work would happen first, and then we would come together to discuss. So to avoid this issue of running out of time at the end of panel discussions. So we did that. So I invited 17 participants for 2 months to discuss on a collaborative shared platform called Framapad, which is very much like Google Docs, where we've been writing. We've been basically talking about some of the questions that have emerged from the work I had been doing before. So we've been discussing through 4 different Framapads, or 4 different discussions, and so this is the first one in the 4, and each of the 4 had some prompts. So in this one, so the focus of this panel and our discussion has been the question of labor. So it's entitled Collectivity, Labor, Value, and Social Reproduction. And some of my prompts started with effectively the questions that I asked in the beginning, were to do with the difference between work and artwork in the context of collective working together or being a part of a collective, and what kind of labor counts when we, as artistic work, and how can we account for different forms of labor that fall outside of that. So this kind of discrepancy between what we historicize as the work of a collective and all the forms of labor, you know, who is doing all the childcare, who is doing all the administration, who is doing all the kind of making of props, say, in certain kinds of work. So these kind of questions started us off. And so I'm not going to say anymore. I think at this point I will just introduce our panelists or our conversationalists over the past 2 months. And then I will do very quick introductions and then ask everybody to say a little bit about their way in. So this evening we have Fabiola Fiocco, who is a researcher, curator, and organizer, and Marie Curie PhD fellow at University of Edinburgh. We have Katja Praznik, who is an associate professor in arts management at University of Buffalo and an author. We have Karolina Majewska-Güde, who is a researcher, art historian, and curator based in Berlin. Kirsten Lloyd, who is senior lecturer in curatorial theory and practice at University of Edinburgh, and Jelena Vesić, who is a curator, theorist, and lecturer based in Belgrade. So that is my bit. So at this point, I wanted to ask our panelists to come in, and if you could each, in this order that I've introduced you, I can repeat it. If you could each just say, talk about what your, the way that your practice or your engagement with collectivity connects with the preoccupations of this project. In other words, the kind of connection between your practice and the kind of questions that this project engages with. And secondly, if you could just say how you have found this experience of being part of this kind of artificially created collective, because not all of us knew each other, but some did, how this experience has been for you. And then we will come back to engaging with some of the questions later. So if I could start with Fabiola.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Lina, for this introduction. I'm very excited now that you have kind of went through the whole process. So yeah, as you said, I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Edinburgh, and in my research, I'm trying to develop a feminist account of socially engaged practices, and I'm doing it through the lens of social reproduction, because I think, as you said, it's very important to look at ways that labor, and specifically reproductive labor, is discussed, made visible, and reconfigured in these projects and spaces and groups. And I'm also trying to do this by looking at it from 3 different perspectives, which is the activist, curator, and artist, and the way in which they intersect. And in this sense, the collective dimension that these different positions articulate when engaging in emancipatory practices. Then in a theoretical perspective, I feel very involved in the project and the topics that we have been discussing. But then also from a personal perspective, I really resonate with and others, because I've been part of different art and activist collectives, and I am now a founding member of Art Workers Italia, which is an independent association of art workers born during the first wave of the pandemic to demand fair working conditions and redistribution of resources, among other things. And for me, it has been a very precious experience because I've been part of the collective from the very beginning. So how to organize and how to really build the collective process has been a major part of the conversation, besides the campaigning, the political activity, and the work. And thinking of what we have experienced in this month, it has been interesting for me to observe how in such a little time we managed to go through lots of the impasses that we experience in collective labor, and how work and real life always creates different paces for people, and how important it is to negotiate the space, even if the space is online. So how to be present in the space, but also how to navigate according to other people, how to not take too much time, too much space in the conversation, and let the conversation flow, be reactive to other, but also manage to bring forward what I felt was relevant in the conversation. So yeah, I think these were the things that come to my mind in reaction to what this experience has been and is going to be. So yeah.
Thank you, Fabiola. Katja.
Hi, my name is Katja Praznik, and I'm originally from Slovenia. I work in the US in Buffalo, where I'm currently also situated, and we still have daylight as opposed to most of you in the evening time already. So I've been invested in the question of labor exploitation in the arts for quite some time now. And this is also how I entered this conversation today, and also on the FRAMPAD, where I was the least present member, I have to admit. But the question or the issue of collectivity for me is, and all the thoughts that I want to share with you today later on also, are really connected to the attempts to help build the labor power through organizing. something in the context of art. And I think that I agree very much with what Fabiola just mentioned, that it was in a way interesting that we had these conversations before written, and all the usual topics that emerge when we discuss collectivity, when we discuss issues of social reproduction, of, you know, patriarchal oppression that happens in so many insidious ways. But also to how to navigate this. I think that after the pandemic, the pandemic has introduced us to this online world where we feel that we have the day is longer than it actually is. And so I think that for me, navigating the reality of the online time, which seems as if, you know, it's not real time, but it is in fact really real time, poses a lot of issues, I think, because you would like to be present in many conversations, but after all, the day has 24 hours, and that's, I think, a limitation. But it was very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you, Katja. Karolina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and introduction. So I'm an art historian, researcher working predominantly with avant-garde art from socialist Europe, feminist art, artistic research, and two very strong elements of my practice are also main reasons for me being here. First is the one that I do exercise collective authorship. I work in collaborative and collective ways with artists or with curators, and as I try to explain in our conversation online, this kind of switching the roles, it's a way that I think of a method for historizing or for thinking about writing differently about collectives. And this leads me to the another strong kind of part of my practice, which is a reason for me being here. It's that I'm very much interested in how. So not only in feminist art and recuperation of the practices which were marginalized, but through this recuperation, I'm interested how to think differently and operate differently within the art historical discipline, let's say, and how to, which I will also speak a little bit later about, how to not reproduce existing narrative models and existing terminologies which have their own particular genealogies. So a little bit utopian, but very happy to share in this context.
Great, thank you, Karolina.
Maybe I just should mention, I should also mention about the experience. So maybe I just shortly say that speaking the same language, I had a feeling that we did not have to, we could skip a lot of conversation, negotiating terms, that we knew what we are talking about. This was very good experience. And also at some point, we lost control over who is writing what, and it became like automatically a collective expression. And also, I think we are all talking about similar issues from slightly positionalities, but it could be a collective expression, a collective statement in a sense. And a kind of Microsoft made it for us in a sense, because we lost the track who is speaking, who is saying so. So it was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So my name's Kirsten and I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'm a contemporary art historian, and I'm also sometimes curator, and I use curating as a research methodology. And I suppose my engagement with collectives has primarily come through writing about collectives who are engaged with social practice, broadly conceived. So I'm particularly interested in collectives who work alongside or within social reproduction struggles, such as to do with food or housing. And most recently, I've been writing about Wochenklauser, the Austrian collective, and also the sound art collective Ultra Red. So that's the sort of perspective I'm coming from in terms of art. In terms of organising, I think it's this came up in the FramPad. I'm a organiser with Living Rent as well. So Living Rent is Scotland's tenants' union, so struggling for things like rent controls and things around short-term lets and housing rights. So I'm involved with them, and I'm really interested to see how Living Rent as a union links with the collective model. When does a collective turn into an institution or turn into a union, and how can we think across these different formations, if you like? So that's my sort of organising perspective as well. In terms of my experience with the FramPad, I thought we were just talking about how busy we all are. This is a very common thing to talk about how busy everyone is all the time. But I think that it's interesting to me that the FramPad became a way of organising collaborative working as a means to manage excessive workloads that we're now all familiar with. So we could catch up at night, we could catch up at weekends and things like this. And I suppose this is facilitated through technology, but also through this sort of collective and collaborative mode of production. And I suppose that taps into some of the points, the sort of critiques of collective and collaborative modes of production within a sort of capitalist system that I'd like us to maybe address today. So thanks. Well, I should also say just how nice it is to come to a meeting like this, sort of already sort of understanding perspectives before we start the conversation. I think that's really nice.
Hey, Jelena.
Hi, ciao, from very polluted city of Belgrade, like the third most polluted city in the world these days. So for me, this entire question, or like the lake of questions, is something that I'm very related to from private reasons. Because I'm obviously I'm obviously unfinished individual in a capitalist sense, in a sense that I can hardly say what do I personally desire, what do I personally want. My question have always been, what can I do for collectivity, society, and so on. So this is like a big psychological burden for me, like a life burden in these turbo-capitalist conditions, which, of course, I mean, as all of us are going through, is posing this question of a sense, of a meaning of what we are doing. And in my professional, but also very much life practice, I've been part of different collectives. One was a theoretical collective gathered around the journal Prelom for Images and Politics that comprised of a political theory chapter and artistic chapter. And this experience was very interesting also in terms that, as many journalists that I learned about only after, have suffered from the similar problems that we suffered, and which are gender problems, and which are problems social theory, like on top, and then everything artistic a little bit on bottom. And yeah, so this was very interesting experience, and also an experience that didn't reach these questions that we are, I think, discussing framapads, and in this conversation, which is the question of operational structure of collectivity and self-organizing and actually accepting differences, but maybe also polemicizing about these small things that mean a lot, because in Prelon Collective we were obsessed. Actually, the male part of the crowd, the political theoretical part of the crowd, was obsessed with the statement. What's our statement? What's our program? So in a way, in a tradition of the 20th century, we believed that the moment we make this program as precise as possible, that all the problems, internal problems of internal flow, conversation, division of labor, existence in the capitalist world will be resolved, which was of course very far from truth. And I also had more wide participation in collective processes. One was rather social or caring about artistic labor, but also its political articulation. I was part of and one of the initiators of the network organization called Other Scene that gathered what I like to call these days the first generation of mass freelancers or projectariat, the term by a colleague, Kuba Schrader. So 70 organizations of independent theater groups, journals, artistic groups, curatorial groups, activist groups, feminist groups, and so on. Of course, we struggled for a different organization of the scene, for different principles, so not competition, but collaboration, not selling the resources to each other and earning from resources, but sharing the resources, using the common resources. And we also return to the positive aspects of our Yugoslav socialist heritage, one of which is socialist self-management or worker self-management or social property, which are very important terms. And in which sense I agree with what's been said, that this process is very much useful to hear really different perspectives, but to see how much of commonality in these different perspectives is on precisely the particularities of collective labor and collective practice, first of all, and then to see how the idea of collectives and collectivity, and especially during and after a pandemic, is proved to have a lot of common with the struggle for labor rights, as Katja said. Katja Praznik said, and also for me this is because I said at the beginning that I have this personal psychological suffers of being not really completed individual in this society. Then for me this is also a kind of secretly therapy group. So I find our conversation very, very useful intellectually and emotionally.
Great, thank you, Jelena. Thank you all. So I'm going to slightly change what I said in our brief chat before, because it's already 7:37, and I realize I'm kind of already what I said about running out of time in panel discussions is happening anyway. So rather than responding to each other's points, I think if each of you could just pick up on perhaps one point of discussion, one issue that came up in the Framapad that you found to be relevant or interesting, or perhaps something that hasn't been addressed enough and needs to be more. So if you could just bring that to the discussion. So if each of you could bring one or two, and then I think by the time we've done that, it will be time to open up for a discussion so we can all have a discussion together. So shall we go back to Fabiola?
Okay. Well, so going through the Framapad, I thought, I mean, now I'm realizing that I didn't really reflect on labor, but more on hierarchies and structure, and it became some kind of a self-reflexive reflection. But I would say that my two main points would be hierarchies and structures of organizing. And in preparing my short reflection on these two ideas, I mainly engage with what Lina and Kirsten shared in the Framapad. So I kind of starting from that to elaborate a little bit. And I would just, I would share that, for example, I really appreciated Kirsten's comment as she was sharing her experience with living rent, because it emphasized two key issues, which is working in a highly structured collective endeavor and the predominant visibility and acknowledgement of many individual voice against day-to-day work. And this last issue immediately reminded me of a text of Lara Coleman and Serena Bassi, which I find really funny, but also very honest, that is Deconstructing Militant Manhood, where they analyze how the performances of gender and the gender performance of resistance kind of shape the way that power is distributed in the collective and the way in which this influences the way resistance is perceived. So it's something very aggressive and violent instead of something very practical and that is delved into the everyday. And then following that, I thought about this idea of hierarchy and something that comes from the outside, something that is imposed. But then I was thinking that I don't think that hierarchy is imposed. I don't think it's something that comes from the outside. I believe it's something that is very organic to every type of group endeavors. And I connected this to what I've been reading about feminist organizing and how to make hierarchies visible as the first point for not deconstructing them, but working through them and make them work for us instead of the other way around. So I wanted to also share this other reference, that is the work of Milan Women's Bookstore Collective and the idea of practice of authority. So the way in which they refuted horizontality and try to work through expertise and contextual needs. So every person would take the responsibility for something according to what they were able to do, what they wanted to experiment. And they were able to allow everyone to find their authority and their space as a way to empower themselves without centralizing authority. And to me, this also came back to the idea of reputational capital and how to make, again, reputational capital work for us instead of working for capitalist reproduction. And then to conclude, so I will not take too much time, I want to go back to Kirsten's comment on the differences of experiences, collectivity, and more formally structured organization, because I really thought about it a lot. And I think that sometimes we take for granted that experimental forms of organizing are the best way of organizing. But then I also noticed through my interviews and experiences that experimental forms of organizing might end up being more extractivist, inattentive, and exclusive than formal structures, because they kind of scare people off and they take lots of time of negotiation. And then I also thought of the power of actually sometimes going with things that are more familiar, like more familiar systems that could allow more people to engage in their own time, in their own terms and pace, without needing prior political or theoretical or emotional literacy to be part of these groups. So to not scare them off, but really create a more inclusive space also through more recognizable structures. And as I was writing, I ended up my thoughts with these questions, which is who is in the room, who is talking, who is not, and why. and asking myself if we are really honest to the way that we commit to processes and our position in them. So these were my random scattered thoughts, and I will pass the floor.
Great, thank you. There's so much there. Thank you very much. Okay, Katja.
Okay, so I'll also try to be short and just emphasize a couple of points. So like I said earlier, that a lot of thoughts that on collectivity that I didn't really think as much before, but this project really made me think about them more and connect them to what I'm currently engaged in. It are really connected to these attempts to help build labor power through organizing. And one of the reasons why I was not as present perhaps on the Framapads was because I am actually currently involved in one such endeavor, organizing art workers in Slovenia. And like really very recently, it has not been a month. On October 2nd, we formally established a union called Zasuk, which means turn or twist. And so I can't really think about collectivity outside or without thinking about the exploitation of labor and the deplorable working conditions in the art world. And of course, also its embeddedness in the capitalist mode of production. And so I just want to quickly, a lot of things that Kirsten wrote resonated with the way I see the question of collectivity and also the question of labor. Because my inspiration especially in the last year has really come from the labor movement and really an energized labor movement that I've observed here in the United States, like organizing Starbucks workers. There has been a lot of unionizing of museum workers, and so on and so forth. So, and I think that one of the things that is inspiring for me here, because I write so much about the invisibility of labor in the context of art and why that is so problematic, is because the labor movement has taught me that, I'm inspired because it shows me how how it is problematic to convince a worker that she is not a worker. And that this is one of the best ways of how one of the best or one of the most pervasive union busting strategies, right? You convince somebody that they are not a worker, they live in capitalism, but they don't consider themselves as worker. Think about gig economy, not just art workers. And then the other thing that inspires me are also a number of female voices in the context of workers organizing, labor organizing. One example that I can give you is Jane McAlevey, a US based labor organizer that is also very involved in training for how to do organizing. And because she always emphasizes the power of collective action in fighting for labor standards, to fight against exploitation. And what does that mean, right? What does that mean when we act collectively? And I think that this history of labor movement and contemporary women labor organizers are crucial in the context of art. Especially because they really help us with how to demystify this individualism that is so rampant in contemporary art world, despite all the art collectives, I would say, that are trying or attempting to change the structural and historic condition of that is, which really, I think, centers an individual and individualism as such. And so the history of labor movement and these invigorated attempts at worker organizing today are, I think, also central. And I want to cite here Sergio Bologna, who recently argued that why individualism is such a big problem. And I think it will resonate with the context of art. And I'm just going to cite him. He says, individuals who think of themselves as independent beings, who don't need anyone, who base their existence not on relationships with others, but on individualism, are precisely those who lose their freedom to a large extent, especially in employment relationships. they negate solidarity, community, and mutual help, and find themselves the objects of the most unbridled exploitation, because as individuals, they have the weakest position in the market. And I think that when I read this, I was like, okay, this is precisely the issue in the context of art, because this individualistic logic really pushes art workers in this competing mode. And I think that is really a problem, because, and then based on that, right, I think that it's, we have this idea of artwork being exceptional. And so when you pair these two things, we are screwed, to put it very bluntly and not very, you know, articulately. So for me, the collectivity is not an ideal, but I think it is rather a political practice that connects, you know, the struggle against individualism and merit-based ideology that enables exploitation in the art. And, you know, like I said, I wrote about this invisibility and exceptionality of artwork in my book Artwork. And I also think that the legacy of Yugoslav socialism, even if there are not that many examples in the actual art world, there are a few cases where we see that there were attempts to build collective power of art workers, and to develop tools of how artworks can defy the power of art institutions and negotiate labor and economic standards. So I think that these are some important points. And I won't say more, because I would like others also to talk, that I'm of course very inspired by Marxist feminist critique of domestic work and housework, but I'll leave that perhaps for a later discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Katja. Yeah, so many points to pick up on. Karolina.
Yes, thank you. So there were several questions that we posed, or were posed by Lina at the beginning, which kind of inspired me to reconfigure the ways how I was thinking about the very particular moment of the transition between, let's say, collective work together, and the moment of the transition of this collective work together towards art infrastructure, and different experiences that we shared with the path showed me that this is not such a linearity. It doesn't necessarily goes like that, because my personal experience was always of collective work, collective practice being appropriated by, let's say, capitalist system. Once all the rules, once it's being institutionalized, or as being visualized, once it gets visibility. And I understood through our discussion that it's part this transition, or this mainstreaming of the practice. It's as Katja just mentioned, it's not about certain ideal going towards corrupted world. It's rather certain practice that has to be maintained through different tactics and strategies, maybe dispersed, and I think that this was helpful to share this experiences. And also I look at the artistic practices of infrastructural critique, how they deal with this idea of implementing different ways of working to maintain collectivity, collective authorship, and well-being. And I am currently within the feminist art practice. It's very much answering this question, how to mainstream or transition from doing things together to doing things together within the actually existing art world. And another point that that was interesting and important for me is this thinking about different conceptions of collectivity. It was the question that was posed: how how I propose to deal with this topic is to, in case of historizing, for instance, performance art histories, is to, when one thinks through the lens of labor, one can redefine or rethink performance as a collective practice, and this is the format of retroactive or retrospective art history, which doesn't use actually existing today terminologies, but rather to try to excavate certain strategies and look use different vocabularies to write, to historize them. And maybe I will just stop here, and we can develop on this if you are interested in the topic of, because I have a feeling that we are speaking a lot about current conditions, and the historization or thinking about writing art history was not so much in the center of our discussion. So maybe I will just stop now, and then we can come back to this topic later.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very connected, but maybe we could have gone into or can go into it more. But yeah, lots of points there that I'm also very involved and interested in. Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you. Karolina, you raised a really interesting question in the FranPad that has really stayed with me, that was about what happens, as you say, when collectives try to engage with or interact with the mainstream art world, and how everything might go quite well up until that point, but then there's a sort of form of disintegration that takes place when there's a sort of attempt to engage with, for example, funding and other institutions and things like that. So everything works well up until that point, and then significant challenges are faced when trying to integrate into quite in some ways a monoculture, if you like. And while you were talking, I think mostly about funders and institutions, I was thinking about it in terms of, as an art historian, writing about contemporary art. I think I've often come across this issue of trying to write as an art historian about contemporary art collectives. So maybe not what you were referring to laterally there, but thinking about art that's produced maybe in the last 10 or 20 years. And if we can see art history as one of the sort of disciplinary infrastructures of the art world, and thinking about how we write about socially engaged practice, it's a really difficult thing. So collectives are often working, I think, these days with socially engaged methodologies. And it's a practical question of writing about that kind of practice. You know, how do you find out what actually happened when the artists were durationally engaged with particular sort of communities? But there's another bigger question, I think, for me at the moment, which is about how we write about these works where artist collectives engage with other collectives or communities who are non-artists. And in my view, as I said in the FranPad, there's a really sort of dangerous, I think, flattening that takes place in that interaction. There's a sort of flattening of the participants or the collaborators, even when they take the form of what Grant Kester calls sort of politically coherent communities. And I think there's lots of examples of artists who are basing their work upon sort of established political communities or collectives, or better, engaging durationally with them. But it's often the non-artists who are doing the sort of hard work of organising. Yet when we come in as art historians and we're writing about this work, we're often focusing only on the experiences of the artist or from the artist's perspective. And I think the differences between the artists and the participants, or however, you know, whatever terminology, I agree that there's a problem with the vocabulary that we use. I think that these are often very sort of classed and raced, you know, and gendered differences that are articulated in socially engaged projects that I think we really need to attend to. So I think that there's an issue here in terms of ethics and access, but also in terms of politics. So when we're actually writing about artist collectives who are dealing with sort of social or political issues, is giving a very skewed account of political action, was the thing that I wanted to sort of pull attention to. And what methodologies do we need these days in order to sort of address this flattening that takes place? It's not an easy thing to do. I think as art historians, we're not trained to do this. So it's a problem in those in terms of education as well. And the second point that I wanted to raise was that it came up today, actually, because I was teaching Melanie Gilligan's work, The Common Sense, which is a sort of feminist sci-fi mini-drama, which is about this sort of dystopian future where there's a technology that's invented that people can feel what it is another person's feeling in real time. So there's this opportunity to have this different form of exchange with people where you're sharing emotions and sensations and feelings. And the question that's posed is, if we had that form of technology, would we have a sort of different, more empathetic, collective future? Or do you think it would sort of lead to, you know, what influence, I suppose, does a sort of working under capitalist conditions have on the technologies that we establish, that we use and that we formulate? So I suppose the question was that it struck me that there's a real problem, I think, in terms of the words again that we use, that are often considered to be sort of have inherent to them an idea of radical politics or anti-capitalism or feminism, things like care, collaboration and things like that. It's been written about quite a lot, but I wonder where collectivity comes in those debates. How might we think through the sort of overlaps and the distinctions between collective and collaborative labour? So I think, you know, we're very familiar in the university, for example, with the demand to collaborate, and that's very much part of the neoliberal university. How does that then translate to collectivity and the potential futures of collectivity? Because I think if we think with artists like Melanie Gilligan, you know, without a sort of fundamental transformation of the economy, I'm not sure that collectivity has a necessarily sort of radical potential. So those would be my contributions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jelena.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. This was very, very useful when you mentioned this sci-fi potentiality to feel others people's emotions, because this is what's lacking in the nominality of what's being said, and precisely the nominality of what's being said, or what is the program of collective, you know, like where a lot of, which is quite often loaded with these words of solidarity, collectivity, and so on. Although quite often these words were quite emptied of a meaning. And it is also the case, as you or someone else mentioned, the artists, collectives working with other like political collectives, or in example, individual artists using the historical topics of political movements, struggles, like difficult historical movements, that what is happening in front of our eyes, which is the matter of the institution of art, or I would even go further and say ideology of art, which is very determined by this notion of the author, which is very proprietary function. And I think collectives are not divorced from that proprietary function. In the project that I work on recently in Ljubljana, which is called on collectivizing narratives about Yugoslav avant-garde art collectives and examples of feminist interventions, where Lina participated as well with the archive of her politically engaged and revolutionary aunt, or Džuverović, who was part of the bigger non-aligned movement and the movement for liberation struggles taking place in the countries in the process of decolonization. I also raised this question on certain narcissism in collectives, because collectives are often presented within the image. Like this is the collective. So and this is if in Yugoslav history, this is either the role of people So the people are standing in a line, presenting. The visualization of this image also tells a lot. I mean, if we analyze it semiotically, that this is some kind of front. So there is some kind of program. They go somewhere. They are certain avant-garde, like they are standing that vanguardistically, and then you have these other types of collectives who are a bit queered from in regard to the representations in leftist politics and avant-garde politics in the 20th century. So who are in a certain ludistic poses. And both images are very much narcissistic, which leaves the collective in the status of a nomen, so in the status of an author, which is, as I said, like very proprietary function. So the question is how to get rid of this authority expressed otherwise. And then Karolina mentioned the need to historicize differently, and Fabiola and Katja mentioned the need to produce new terminology, not just for the sake of production of new terminology. That's a part of big digestion mechanism in our academic world, but to produce new terminology to signify something else, to put an emphasis on something else, because collective is an image, it is a nomen. And here I think what we are discussing, and what I also raised as a question in this project, is the verb, like collectivizing, or the gerund, like, so collectivizing, which is the process, so which is lasting, which needs its methodology, which is day-to-day practice, which is insisting on something, but also meeting concrete issues and so on, and which is, of course, embracing a much larger collectivity of participants than, like what's framed with the picture as a collective. So. Yeah, I think mainstream art world today is not only undergoing the process of new conservativity, like returning to this romantic idea of an author, but it also totally bypasses of what's known as art, as old art, and going different direction of cultural industries and this cognitive labor production of images online and blah, blah, blah. Like more in the context of new technology. And I think that in this context, we are quite often also facing the problem that the modes of production that are given a birth in the collective practice or in the emancipatory practice are appropriated by the capital in order to reduce labor costs and increase the profit.
Great, thank you very much, Jelena. Thank you to everyone. We're doing quite well. It's 8:06. So I won't attempt to sum up. I just wanted to say something that really kind of jumps out at me from the way everyone is speaking, is this kind of parallel experience we've all had and are having now of thinking through these things, theorizing, drawing on our experiences, but also having this happen in real everyday life in our work. So we're struggling with time, we're struggling with organization, with how to do it. We're organizing, Katja was talking about it, we're all kind of, it feels urgent. To me, it feels urgent to understand and to work through these questions, both theoretically, but also in literally our day-to-day work. I mean, I won't go into it too much, but as well, at my end, in parallel with this, there's a lot happening at the end of my, in my job at the university, where I'm switching between these conversations and meetings with the union and meetings with colleagues. So it all feels kind of simultaneous and urgent. And that's something that came out for me from the way everybody's talking, whether it's living rent or whether it's organizing artists in Slovenia and in the region, or whether it's our own experiences of our own work. I feel that not only do we need a new language, but I think we need to think about collectivity on collectivity's own terms. So this idea of constantly being kind of falling into the trap of structures that we are already operating within. So, for example, the way that the art world has embraced collectivity with such excitement and joy, collectives are now curating biennials and documenta and this and that and the other, which is, yes, great, but there is no actual critique of that and analysis of what actually happens in those processes and who's doing what and what the structures of behind those kind of glossy names and this collective and that collective. And I think that's really interesting, that there's this kind of utopian rose-tinted glasses sense of, oh, it's a collective, so everything is fine, everything is equal, and it's really radical, and it's really going to change everything. When the actual paradigms, the actual formats and ways in which we are articulating all this are completely the same. It's just the name is not, Hans Ulrich Obrist, it's a collective. I mean, we need to kind of really work through that and challenge it as well. So that's all I just wanted to say. That those are the kind of things that really jump out across what everyone has said. But do we have any questions? And also, do any of the speakers want to respond to anything others have said or kind of speak to each other? But I'm now opening it up to everyone. And if people would like to put their cameras on so we can see who's here. I know we have some people from other panels as well. So that would be great to see some other faces, because as you can imagine, we have been writing, but we haven't actually seen each other's faces very much. So it's nice to see people. Okay, questions? We've got about 20 minutes. I know there was a lot there.
We're doing our best to fit the tight timeline, so go for the questions.
Yes,
I have a question for Fabiola, but I think there's one in the text,
Can you hear me?
chat.
Hi, can you hear me? So I'll read it out. Am I audible? I can't tell.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a question from Toby, who says, "Thank you for the discussion. What intrigues me most when reading about art through the lens of labor is the similarities between art and capitalism, how they both blur the boundaries between life and work, how they both depend on production of individuality, the production of individuality, sorry. My question is, could writings generated within the discipline of art history still have the radicality and possibility to initiate any form of valid critique against capitalism? And if so, how?"
Does anybody want to take that question, Katja?
I mean, this is great because I'm a sociologist talking about, but anyway, history of art, I do know some. I'm not an art historian, but I do think that there is a lot of, there are radical positions in terms of how you can navigate the question of struggle against capitalist system within the arts, right? But I think that, and in my view, for instance, it's interesting to look at, for instance, work of Goran Đorđević, who wanted to initiate this international strike of artists coming from socialist Yugoslavia, where like people in capitalist country looked at him, that like which utopian world do we live in socialism, right? That we can think about the strike, where we know that if artists go on strike, there will always be another group of artists that will take the opportunity to do whatever they're striking against. But I think that there are that you can think about these things, but I think that there needs to be an awareness about that art and capitalism are not separate. I mean, Western idea of art is intimately and very much connected to the rise of capitalist mode of production. So I think that to think about these two things separately is something that I take the lesson from Marxist feminists, who really challenged the idea of production and reproduction. I mean, they maintain the difference discursively and conceptually, but in order to break it down, because, you know, whatever is considered productive and whatever is considered to be reproductive is actually part of this general problem and or the system of capitalist mode of production. So I think that I would say that there are radical positions, but that we need to be careful not to make a distinction between art and capitalism, because I don't think that serves us.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that question? I mean, for me, I think I find a lot in the discipline of art history, but I feel I need to, when I'm working with or kind of working from art historical examples or analysis or reading, I need to kind of perform some modifications to what I'm reading in order for it to be useful for me. So I find that art history can be a really useful lens, but my problem is the focus on the object and the linearity of art historical narratives. So if you kind of try to undo those and use some methodologies, like obviously, you know, Griselda Pollock and Linda Nochlin, et cetera, and many others more contemporary feminist art historians, I think that's where interesting things can begin to happen, where you begin to undo the focus on object, but keep some methods. So for me, that's how I kind of use it, but I sort of need to really shed a lot, because I'm not interested in a particular painting and its analysis, or for that matter, you know, any art form. So it's more about the methodologies and the relations, really.
Yeah, I can also add a few things in line with what I was speaking before, also with this verb collectivizing, which for me meant voluntary transfer of private ownership to the collective. This is the problem. The problem is in equalizing the author's name, in connecting the name of the author, and actually building the discourse of the author in the context of capitalist production, so in the context of private property. And we should think about something else. In example, even John Berger suggested that you know, like, in order to speak about non-proprietary art histories, we should pose the question not who made this object, but how this object was made and under what circumstances. So then it is telling us about the process of production, which is also a laboring process, which is also the process which deals with the different contradictions of capitalism and capitalist system, because art is not separated from capitalism. But in this idea of free labor, under the quote marks, there is this desire, it cherishes this desire to do some change, to do some break through the capitalist wall of thinking. And yeah, in that sense, we can also return to recent histories, like in different regions. And an example, in our region, we had this systemically introduced type of property in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century in the former Yugoslavia, Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, the property that's not mean to be private, but also not the state property as in other socialist countries, which is a kind of euphemism for private property. It is also a form of privatization, and in some discussions, this socialism is also interpreted as a state capitalism. So in the idea of social ownership, you have a public property, so the property which does not have this legal title holder, the holder of the property right are not political institutions nor the economic entities, but the citizens or the workers. So the things are always built from below, which is one of the ideas of the system of socialist self-management in Yugoslavia, which was not ideal and which has its like entirely big political critique and economic critique and so on, but is an attempt, I mean, from today's perspective and the perspective of us now discussing the smaller collective structures than is really the huge infrastructure of the state. I think this was like a big human achievement, of course, that always needs time to develop.
Maybe I would like to add one very small thing to that. Just tackling the question from a very practical point of view and building on what we have been talking about, because I think that the things we discuss kind of respond to this question and how it is necessary to do historical work for continuing the struggle. So to not look at art history as something that is done to excavate and create canons, but to kind of pass it on knowledge to people that are organizing and be also ecological in that sense, so not waste all the experiences of previous collectives and not have this idea that political work and political activism is always new and groundbreaking. Like we are always building on our historical, on the legacies of struggles, and we need to recognize that and cherish that and learn also from what went wrong and what was successful. And in this sense, I also wanted to say something else, but now it kind of slipped my mind. Oh yeah, I wanted to say that to me, it's very important to look at this through the ways in which theory is used in grassroots movements. So how grassroots movements collectively study and theorize and read theory in reading groups and try to make sense of things together and not have this idea of theory as something that pertains to the institution, the academia, and the practice of art history as something that is detached from us.
Very quick one. I think that we all work transdisciplinary, and it's kind of difficult to say what is art history today, what is not anymore, but I would just like to say that it's like a double process of if we rethink art, we are also rethinking this discipline possibilities of being critical. So we work on both in a sense.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just add something quick. I mean, I suppose a few of us have been interested for a few years now in this idea of a sort of a militant art history and recovering this idea and what that might actually mean. You know, does it mean direct engagement with social movements and things like this? You know, and I think one thing it certainly has to mean is sort of getting beyond critique just in and of itself. But one of the things I wanted to just pull out from what Jelena was talking about there was, you know, this move of this interest in practices and processes and contexts and relationships rather than objects. I wonder if this is what leads us to this idea of collectives, of thinking about collectives rather than individual artists. It seems to lend itself, you know, the sort of, you know, the format of the collective seems to lend itself to that kind of focus. But I suppose I just wanted to go back to, you know, what is our definition of collective here? Because when we were writing in the Framapad, I was just thinking, this is so broad. It encompasses so many different things and so many different types of relationship to the art world. some very, very distant, and some right there, right in the middle. And I think that maybe we need to sort of be more nuanced in what we mean by a collective, because, you know, here in Scotland, artist-led initiatives are a really strong feature of the contemporary art scene. And they are formulated usually according to a sort of collective model. Artists come together for 2 years in this sort of long project, this sort of projectification, as you were talking about, Jelena, but really come together to sort of work together to programme a small institution effectively. And that has now become a real stepping stone within an art career, an individual's art career. So individuals come together to work collectively for a short period of time, and that then enhances their career. And I think we need to be able to sort of differentiate between different modes of collective endeavour and collectivity.
If I might add one small sentence to it, it would be also related to artistic education in general, going in terms of collaboration, working together, research, and this process of exchange. And it starts already formatting for me. One of the skills that artists have to acquire, it's a skills of exchanging, collaborating, and they are defined in the similar ways like in other cognitive capitalist professions, basically. So this big change in art academia since 20 years also reformulates the notion of collaboration and collectivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Katja.
I also wanted to add something. As a sociologist, I can't help myself. But you know, there's Howard Beckett, who defines art as a collective practice, right? And I think this brings us back to our question about collectivity and who counts and who doesn't count, right? So I think that collectivity in the arts is not about a group of artists coming together, because any art, I mean, art is a collective practice. So, you know, it's like, if you look at it from in broader terms, it's art historians, art critics, you know, the people who put up the objects or take care of them. I mean, within the institution, everyone that takes care of that, you know, from the janitors to, you know, to the secretaries and whomever. So I think that this also brings us to what I think Jelena put well in terms of like this collective as an image, as an object, as an ideal, right? It's this moment of fetishization of certain terms and concepts, while we actually always work to, in a certain sense, collectively. But I think that really this neoliberal rationality has really pushed us to think about every little thing separately rather than that. And that's why I think that to a certain extent, yeah, we can define it, but on the other hand, it's just, I think we need to more than acknowledge how many people and all the different levels that, you know, making the art actually entails in that sense. And that this is where we then don't lose everyone that is not, you know, the others that this project talks about, right? Because I think that immediately when we start thinking about collectivity as a group of artists, we have already excluded a bunch of people who are part of that process, but we are others, right? We are doing the othering non-stop then.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I mean when I think about the, collectivity on its own terms. So we are talking about collectivity, but we are using imposed terms, imposed structures. And even if you look as not so far, but if you just look at theater or film, it's a different picture entirely. So I think there's a lot of undoing to do. We have 2 questions in the chat.
So Kim's question is, thank you for opening up such rich topics. How would you evaluate success in collectivism? Documenta and Reproduction were mentioned as an example for lack of visibility of the process. Reproduction mentioned one measure of success as ongoing/new collaboration and wider access to opportunities and shared resources to enable new work being done. But I do think there is an opportunity to understand the practicalities of collectivism with regards to the decision-making process and the balance of work being done. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I'm going to mute and just open that to the floor and just see if we can maybe extend the meeting just by 5 minutes.
I think it won't cut off. So as long as people are happy to stay a few more minutes longer, it's fine. Teams doesn't cut off, it just warns you. So yeah, it's up to you guys how hungry or tired you are. Does anyone want to respond to that? I mean, yeah.
Can I? Success in collectivity, I think it's also one of these questions that we don't really want to anymore deal about. Of course, we can say that certain aims can be met, but I don't want to use this language. I don't want to focus on of thinking of collective in terms of achieving some success. I want to look how the process of production, how the common work is being beneficial for members of the collective, and how we can think differently of precisely of what is included into the art work and what is excluded, and how not necessary in terms of succeeding, right?
So Jimena's question is, what do you see are good examples of leadership within collectives that from your perspective create alternatives for fair time and labour conditions for all and acknowledgement of individuals in the collective?
Maybe I could just have a quick go at that, and also the previous question, just from my own recent experience, that really draws from what Fabiola began with talking about highly structured collectives and how they function, because it strikes me that there's often a sort of, as Fabiola said, a sort of fetishization of horizontal models. And we recently did a project with Glasgow Women's Library, which began life as a collective and kind of institutionalized, if you want, but has tried to embed feminist leadership strategies, as they call it, within their organizational model. And I've always found that really interesting, that the way they talk about how horizontality isn't exactly fair necessarily, and they talk about how taking responsibility and accountability, as Fabiola was outlining, is a form of sort of feminist can be a form of sort of feminist practice and an appreciation and giving space and value and agency to people and their work. And it's the same with Living Rent, I suppose. It's this sort of familiar structure that is then dedicated to distributing agency across as far as possible. So it's a structure that allows the sharing of power. And I suppose that's what interests me, that flat structures often don't allow an effective sharing of power and agency, because it is, I think you talked about charisma, Lina, in the collective, which I find really interesting. I find charisma fascinating, particularly in the art field and in football, actually. But this idea of, these charismatic figures and how they can, really dominate. And in Living Rent, for example, they have a really interesting, they have acknowledged that the majority of the work in the collective is actually done by women, but the most vocal and visible protagonists within the union are men. And they've addressed this by having lots of training, having lots of different activities to actually try and address this through a structure of distributed power. So I would say that Glasgow Women's Library is maybe a really interesting model to look at, certainly not the only one, though.
Anyone else on that?
I mean, I don't really have good examples of leadership within collectives. I was just thinking how hard it is to judge a collective from the outside without experiencing the way in which it functions, also in a longer term, because then things starts to rise as things have to be developed and the work has to move on. And in a way, it also connects to the question about documenta, because I think it was very important to see how the collectives are being integrated in the intellectual part, in the conceptual production. But then there is no collectivization in the organization of work, and there's no discussion of work conditions. And this has been very clear walking around the different venues, looking at the manifestos made by the mediators and how they were denouncing their working conditions in this process of documenta. And I think that in a way, what I will always appreciate when looking at collectives is how they are upfront in their working organization and how much they share about their structure, who does what, how work is organized, how time is managed, who is paid and who's not. And today I was looking at Arica's website here in Scotland, and on their website they state very clearly who's part of the group, who has been part of the group, and that they try to follow the fair working conditions statement. Now, I don't remember the exact terminology, but to be very clear about the way in which people work in a context is, for me, is always a good sign, in contrast of very blurry theorization and discourses around how collective we are.
I would totally second that. I think that this transparency or like openness about this is really important, because then it gives you an opportunity to really, you know, to make it very clear, right, what it is. Because I think I also appreciate your point about the commenta and all the collective stuff. I mean, yeah, and did we talk about the working conditions? No, we didn't, right? I mean, I think that the art world really has perpetually shows how you can, you know, make an image or make an object out of a problem. For instance, you know, like it's very now, it's very popular to talk about labor in the arts, but then you exhibit it on the wall of a museum. I mean, please, you know, like for instance, the example of Wage was great in that sense, I think, because Wage is a working artist and the greater economy, the US-based organization, and when they did, you know, they were all about working conditions and the problem of payment. And I think at the very, very beginning, when they started, they invited them to, I think the new museum invited them to be part of the exhibition. And it's like, no, we are not here to be exhibited. We can negotiate the fees for all the artists involved in this collective exhibition. And I think that that's the principle, you know, is like where you really also defy and contest this objectivization of certain radical ideas, such as collectivity or labor or non-payment and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have one more question from Kirsten, and I think then we should perhaps wrap up, and we can just say at the end kind of where we go from here in terms of the project.
But I just wondered whether, because there is this tension, right? Like, do you enable the situated care that we're talking about, the processes, the longevity, the responding to individuals and conditions that are constantly shifting and changing, but then sacrifice the image that is put out there to the art world, so it kind of is unreadable almost by it. It slips through the net, or it's not the face that comes through because the processes get you know, plastered over with an image, which is a capitalist move, isn't it? We see it throughout the world. But then is the, I guess I'm just creating a provocative question here, is the only other kind of thing that you can do if you want to maintain these processes to try and think about the fact that in their multiplicity, if there's a multiple of different collectives doing this, that maybe it changes the conditions of the main path, which is art. Maybe it gets art, but you know, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because then has it risked not being visible? So is its path even noticed? I guess that was one of my questions. Yeah. Yeah, like, is it, do you have to just then go to the meta thing of this kind of constellation effect where lots of these different things start popping up, so they just sabotage the very ground that is assumed in the art world, so that you maintain difference? Or is there another mechanism that has to happen? That was really, I guess, the question, which is quite abstract, so apologies to end on that.
No, it's not. It makes sense. Thank you, Kirsten. I think for me, this is just a personal response, but I think Documenta does that to a point with this multitude of collectives, like a collective inviting, I think it was 13 other collectives or something like that. And it does in a way, it opens up a new space of, it is difficult to, I mean, we held another talk about this recently where, you know, it is difficult to commodify Documenta if you're teaching it, if you're trying to show images from it, if you're trying to kind of say this is what it was and these works were great. It's not so easy because there are many voices, and within those voices there are many other voices, and some collectives are also many, and like yeah, anyway, it doesn't matter. But I think Documenta does open up a new space. Like it gives license to a different way of operating. I think in that it was successful. What the problem is that we all got sidetracked with the controversies and problems rather than really focusing on this potential in that kind of a non-commodified form of exhibition making. And I think with time that will kind of resonate. But I think for now we're just going to be stuck on what was that?
Okay, that's really interesting to hear, because I like that a lot, because in a way my concern would be that it would inculcate through the Documenta's hosting as a general form of care, even though you have these specifics in it, because it still maintains some sort of that framework. But if it is actually enabling that multiplicity of difference to occur, which I think, like you say, we have to sit with, then possibly it is offering an alternative model, which is exciting.
I think it's more taking what is happening anyway everywhere, but kind of maybe below the radar and a bit off the kind of mainstream gaze. It's sort of taking it into a mainstream arena. I think that's what it did, because so many of us went there and went, yes, of course, this is an exhibition. This is how things could be, and got excited. But but for some people maybe it was like, well, where's the art? Where's the pristine, kind of extended captions telling me what this is? So because you couldn't see the authors easily, you couldn't see particular works in many cases. A lot of the time it was kind of genuinely a process with just some forms of some visual elements. So I think it kind of mainstreamed, or it brought into the spotlight something that's been happening for everywhere all the time, really.
It's a matter of scale, basically.
Yeah.
Of scale and enormous budget and official German kind of culture policy.
Yeah, and it also got its fingers slapped for doing it too open, like being too. I mean, Rowan Gruppa and others got their fingers slapped for kind of attempting to do something that was a little bit radical for Documenta, I think. Right. Any closing comments, because we've been here for a long time now?
I wanted to add something. I mean, I'm not sure I fully understood Kirsten's question, but it made me think of the way in which I'm experiencing art workers organizing, and how art workers are building a kind of a transnational network, because I always encounter this tension between situated needs that are related to their national infrastructure, the laws in which they operating, the constraints that derive from their local context, and it's something that cannot be abstracted. It's not something that we can address collectively as a global movement, because we have to deal with the day-to-day experience of art workers in a specific area of the world that is in this way because of economic, political, and cultural reasons. But also, I think it's significant how, despite the strictly local dimension of these groups, they're managing to find intersections and exchange tools. So the exchange happens in best practices in organizing, but also practical tools in terms of contracts, policies, ways of campaigning, and then kind of finding moments in which to share on a more general political and abstract level. And then it's never a big collective. It's never going to be a big collective, but it's always going to be a network of constant exchanges that change over time according to situated urgencies. Yeah, and this is what came to mind listening to your question, but I don't know if this is what you were.
No, that totally answers it. You and Lina have answered the way in which this is working without it becoming a kind of another generalized image of what a collective is, which I think is the concern, is that the risk of going a bit more mainstream or global is that you lose differentiation. Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all. I just want to say, in terms of next steps with this project, we are meeting again next for the second panel, second Framapad findings, and the title is Why Collaborate? And it's about network formation, access to networks, and network reproduction. So that is on the 10th of November. And in terms of the project more generally, we've formed a sort of self-selected editorial group, and we've kind of began to talk about what we do with all this material, also including these discussions. So, you know, watch this space. You've all got the email about this, and also the website of the project. So hope to see some of you on the 10th, and thank you to our speakers. It's been fantastic, and there's a lot more to discuss, obviously, and we will continue in one way or another.